Welcome, bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Donc, I will start briefly in French and then we will switch to English. Nous avons le plaisir aujourd'hui d'accueillir le professeur Mathaios Panteli de l'université de Chypre. So, we have the pleasure to welcome Mathaios Panteli from the University of Cyprus. Dans le cadre de la chaire Jaumotte, donc la chaire Jaumotte, c'est une chaire qui a été créée par la fondation Jaumotte du Moulin en l'honneur du baron André Jaumotte, qui a été professeur à l'Université libre de Bruxelles, à l'École polytechnique de Bruxelles, dans le domaine de la mécanique, et qui a été fort actif en particulier dans le domaine de l'énergie. Il a été président de ce qui s'appelait à l'époque de la faculté des sciences appliquées, et puis recteur de l'ULB et président du conseil d'administration. Donc c'est une figure relativement importante de l'ULB. Et donc, suite à son décès il y a quelques années, il a été décidé de créer en son honneur une chaire pour accueillir un professeur étranger. So in the memory of André Jaumotte, it was decided by the Fondation, the Jaumotte du Moulin Foundation, to create a chair to welcome an international professor active in the field of engineering. And it's connected, so this chair is connected to the Royal Academy. So we are here in the rooms of the Royal Academy, and to the Collège Belgique. So one of the conditions for the chair, so we welcome Mathaios for 4 weeks in total, and one request from the academy, and we like this request, is to have 4 lectures, so 1 lecture per week. So we'll see Mathaios a few times until May. So thanks for coming. Mathaios has a slide when he will present himself, so I will not repeat or anticipate the information. So, Mathaios, thank you very much. Thank you also to the Fondation Jaumotte du Moulin and to the Royal Academy. And the floor is yours.
So I would like on my turn to also thank the Academy for the great opportunity to be here, and also Pierre and Pierre for the support in our application and for the hosting in general in Brussels, which is always a great pleasure to be here. So I'm Mathaios Panteli. I'm currently an assistant professor at the University of Cyprus, and I also hold a position as a visitor lecturer in Imperial College London for 3 years now. So my background is, as we see it on the slide. So I did my diploma in electrical engineering in Greece, where I graduated in 2009. Then I did my PhD in electrical power engineering with. I started my PhD with Professor Daniel Kitchen, who is a ULB graduate as well back in the time. And then I did a few years of postdoc at the University of Manchester and also a few years at the University of Cyprus before I moved back as a lecturer in 2017. And then after 4 years, I moved back to Cyprus. So my wife was not very happy with all these changes all the time, but she was very nice following me around. And basically, being in Manchester, it's very much similar weather like today, which lasts for the whole day, the whole year though. There's no seasons. So being from the Mediterranean was a bit difficult for us to adapt in those conditions. Okay, so I will say a few words about the University of Cyprus and the GEO Center of Excellence that I come from Cyprus. So the University of Cyprus is the largest public university of the island. It's a relatively new university, so it was established in 1989 in Nicosia. We account about 7,000 students in total, and I, of course, come from the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. So GEOS, the Center of Excellence GEOS, was established in 2008. GEOS is not an abbreviation, it's actually the titan of intelligence and mind from the Greek mythology. So it was basically tied down with was solving problems. So as engineers, we thought it was a good name to name the center. And if we don't have problems, we create problems as engineers to solve them. We recruit now about 180 researchers, which basically span across a lot of expertise and around critical infrastructure systems. So we work basically on intelligent monitoring, control, management, security of large-scale dynamic systems. And we have faculty members and researchers working across all these areas that you see here, from energy and power systems, transportation, water, telecommunication, emergency management, and recently healthcare as well, after the breakout of COVID. So we cover basically a broad range of topics across many infrastructures. So the power system group is composed of many researchers. We have also 6 faculty members within the power group in Cyprus at the GEO Center. And we recruit basically software engineers, research engineers, PhD students, and postdocs. So we have from junior staff to more senior researchers working, and we cover quite broad themes in the area of power systems, from active management, distribution grids, grid integration of renewables, weather area monitoring, unit commitment, economic dispatch, and also technology reliability, resilience, and flexibility assessment. We are very active in European projects, which is basically our big funding source in Cyprus. Here are just some examples of some projects that we're currently working on. And we're also very much linked and associated with the public utilities in Cyprus, with electricity utilities, including the Electricity Authority of Cyprus, TSOs and DSOs, the regulatory body, and so on. And we actually have a collaboration framework with the Electricity Authority of Cyprus, where basically it's renewed every year. So whenever they have a problem, when they have a study that they want to conduct, GEOS is basically their #1 destination to do applied research with them. So I will say a few words now about the research infrastructure, the pilots we have at our laboratory in GEOS. So, can I move around? Can you hear me? Yes. Is the microphone okay? Yeah? Yeah. Okay, now it's working. It's just for the recording to... It's okay? Okay, good. Because I can't stand all the time at the podium. So basically at the center, with time, and mainly from the recovery funding and the European funding as well, we developed a state-of-the-art infrastructure. So we have a real-time digital twin hardware in the loop setup, where we have an OPAL-RT real-time simulator, which is connected with power amplifier in field equipment. So we have basically about 18 PMUs installed in some stations across the island. So we have a close to full observability of the system. Is it okay? Yes. Yeah.
There's a speaker right here. Don't get too close.
Okay, yeah. So we developed a platform in our laboratory, which is something like a control center, where basically all the measurements from the PMUs we stored on the island, they come in our laboratory, and we can have basically real-time monitoring of the system in Cyprus. So as I mentioned, we have the digital twin of the power system. We can do power and control hardware in the loop using field equipment and also software controllers. And we also recently started working on cybersecurity with some colleagues in our group that are experts in cyber and come back with a background on computer science. So this is how it basically looks. This is the system of Cyprus, which is quite small. And you can see that it's basically up to here, which is divided. Unfortunately, due to the Turkish invasion in 1974, we only have the south part of the island and not the occupied area of Cyprus on the north. So basically, as I mentioned, we have the real-time simulator, which gathers data from the PMUs on the substation of the island. And then we have a full observability on the system, and it's being utilized by the TSO in Cyprus. So whenever there is a disturbance, they want to understand what happened. They often come into our lab in Cyprus to actually go back to the measurements and see what is actually going on in the specific conditions. And then you can basically zoom in, and then you can see the status of the generation stations on the island. You can see the conditions of the substations, the power flows, and so on. And then you can go up and down to some distribution networks that we actually modeled on the island. So we are also trying to capture this TSO and DSO collaboration. We have some parts of Limassol, which is a city in the south of the island modeled, and some villages. So we can also zoom in and go into details on some active distribution networks on the island. We also have some real pilots, which are connected also with our infrastructure in our laboratory. So we have two pilots. So we have one which is a big wind photovoltaic park, which has also some battery storage capabilities. And we also have the microgrid of the University of Cyprus, which is basically, it's what we call a smart microgrid, as it has PV, it has storage, it also has controllability on this unit, so we can do scheduling to optimize the cost and the energy usage of the campus of the University of Cyprus. And we're now installing another big PV park with a battery, if I remember right, 5 MWh battery, to basically make it as standalone and as sufficient as possible in terms of energy usage. And these are just some interfaces that we built for different projects and different clients that we have in our laboratory. Okay, so basically this was just an overview so far of myself and where I come from the university. So in terms of the lectures that we'll be having here, which I hope you will all join in the future. So we are having this lecture today where basically I'm going to walk you through the projects we did in the last 10-15 years, and we'll start going into a bit of introduction of what is resilience, what it means for power systems, how it evolved over the time, how it's defined, and then how it's quantified, how we quantify the resilience using different metrics and different methods in different European international projects that we worked on or led over the years. Then in the second lecture, on the 27th of March, we're going to be using basically what we talked about today, about the quantification of resilience against different hazards. And then we'll see how we can enhance resilience through different risk-aware and resilience-aware planning of power systems, and to see how we can do basically a trade-off decision-making to support the resilience of power grids. Then in the third lecture, we're going to go into more details about cascading analysis and dynamic resilience assessment, touching also upon renewable rich systems, IBR-dominated systems, where we're going to be seeing basically how an outage can propagate across the system, which was initiated or not from an extreme weather event. And then finally, we're going to bring all together and talk about basically multi-sector and multi-vector nexus perspectives, so different multi-energy carriers, different interdependent critical infrastructure, water energy, energy transportation, and so on, to bring it all together under one holistic analysis. So by the end of the lectures, I'm building slowly from the impact quantification to the planning, to cascading analysis and how this fits into the planning, and then to multi-sector and multi-vector nexus perspective in terms of flexibility and resilience. Hopefully we'll cover a lot of aspects together about understanding, quantifying, and enhancing power system resilience. Okay, so an overview of the project that we worked on. I will move there because I think I'm interrupting the... So an overview of the project that we worked on resilience, we can see on this slide. So from 2009, where I started my PhD, it was on power system security, on the traditional approach and definition of security with Professor André in Manchester. Then in 2012, we started the ResNet project in UK, which I will go into more details later. And then over the years, we basically secured funding for projects around the globe, including Chile, Malaysia, and China, USA, and so on and so forth. So we have been working on this topic for the last 15 years, give or take. So in this lecture, I will try to basically, starting from our first applications in ResNet, in the ResNet project, to show how we slowly grow our understanding and applications on the topic. So starting from the ResNet project in UK, so ResNet, the Resilient Networks from Great Britain project, was the first project that was basically awarded and led by a network operator in UK, which had to do purely with resilience. So in this project, we have different work packages, different basically work streams, ranging from the climate and hazard to demand, energy network modeling, fragility modeling, and so on. So we tried basically in this project to bring together power engineers, structural engineers, and social engineers to try to understand what we mean by resilience and what it actually means for UK. And I was a postdoc at that point, and I still remember the first meeting when I walked in the room. And resilience for me back then was something new. I worked on reliability, I worked on security from the Ron Allen and Roy Billiton schools, but resilience was for me something new. So when I asked the project coordinator, what does it mean for power systems? His response was, you tell me with time. I was like, okay. So we had some homework to do then to understand basically what we mean with this topic. Then we secured some funding from Newton Fund, which was basically an initiative from UK to bring together academics from developed and developing countries around the globe. So we started this project in 2016 with Chile, with colleagues from the University of Chile and Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, where we're looking basically at the resilience assessment enhancement against earthquakes. And for this project, we were awarded with the 2018 Newton Prize, which basically was awarded to one of the projects funded by Newton, which had an impact on societies. So the applications that we developed that we'll be talking about in this series of lectures are actually being applied now by the Chilean independent system operator. So we also had the techno-economic framework for resilient sustainable electrification. So once we completed that project, we started this project with Malaysia and China, which all basically had to do, as the title says, to develop schemes and planning models to take explicitly resilience as a criterion when it comes to electrification of rural areas in Malaysia. So basically, these are just some photos that we took from the places we visited in Borneo Island, where we can see basically the impact of landslides and floods, which was the big issue when it comes to electrifying rural villages on the island of Borneo. And also beyond to engineering, we also did some social engagement activities to try to understand what resilience actually and electrification actually means for the people. And this is just one of the installments that we had as an output of the project, which I will be talking about later in the presentation. In 2020-2021, we also had the forward resilience measures with National Grid in UK, which was funded by Ofgem. So basically, the forward resilience measure was a quite late and slow follow-up of the ResNet project, which was completed 5-6 years before the FRM project. So in this project, we basically advanced our modeling when it comes to quantifying the impact of windstorms on the transmission network of UK. We also had a project which I was involved as an advisor with the Department of Defense in the United States, where we're looking basically at cybersecurity, compound basically risk assessment of cyber and physical threats on the military bases of USA. And we had a case study, the Oahu Island in Hawaii, where we basically simulated different random hurricanes, and we tried to see the impact of those hurricanes on the military bases and also on the electrification of those military bases and how resilient and sustainable they are to extreme weather events. Currently, we're running a series of projects, including the R22 project, where basically we're trying to develop a number of products, including the multi-risk assessment framework, which basically it's a cyber security and physical security combined together for power system applications. And we also have different other products, including the resilience suite for TSO and DSO applications, preventive models, and also enhanced maintenance and asset management toolkits. We're also involved in the HVDC WISE project, which are also working together with the NG colleagues here, which is basically looking into how we can design reliable and resilient AC and DC grids. And our role in the project is to develop and implement cascading analysis models, which we'll be talking about in the third lecture, of AC and DC technologies, and try to understand how HVDC links can act as firewalls. Let's say they can mitigate the cascading propagation in future renewable rich AC and DC grids. So basically, also in this project, we're looking at adequacy, security, and resilience aspects in AC and DC systems, and I believe it's probably the first or among the first projects that are actually looking at these topics. And we're also, as a continuation of the forward resilience measure that I talked earlier with National Grid, we currently have the Wellness Project. We're basically looking at whole energy system resilience vulnerability assessment, and it's a similar consortium as the previous one, but now we also bring in Electricity Northwest, which basically is a DSO in the northwest of UK, covering the Manchester area and around Manchester, and also Imperial College, where the aim of the project is trying basically to see how we can embed resilience as a planning criteria for TSO and also DSO applications. So we're trying to basically explore, as we see here, cost-benefit analysis when it comes to building resilience against extreme events. And this is my biggest resilience project of all, my 3 kids, which basically, as I say in the slide, we need to be resilient with my wife, with lack of sleep, lack of or limited personal time, chaos, unexpected health events, and so on. It's my proud as well, although being my chaos. Okay, so going into starting talking about resilience. Resilience is basically starting picking up a lot in the area of power systems in the last decade, I would say, or so. But actually it's not a new concept as a definition. So the first reference of resilience was made actually back in 1818 in this journal you can find online as well, where basically the author of this paper was arguing that plants, trees that were planted in adverse conditions, they actually turn out to be more robust and more resilient to extreme conditions. There's also this very famous paper from Holling, where it basically defined resilience as stability, of ecological systems, and there are also many other papers across different domains that talk about the topic way before we started considering this as a very big issue for power systems. And this is just basically a bibliographic analysis that we did in Cyprus recently to try to see when actually the topic of resilience picked up. We can see that basically up to 2011, 2012, there was limited literature on the topic of power system resilience. And then around 2013, 2014, it actually picked up very rapidly. It's worth mentioning that ResNet was actually positioned here. So it was actually, at the beginning of this pickup of interest on the topic. And here is where our first papers on the topic were released. I'm not saying that we're responsible for this spike here, but we're basically among the first that we actually published on the topic on resilience. And my first paper, my first academic output on resilience, it went through 4 rounds of review in IEEE, because back then it was very blurred what it means, how it would be quantified, and so on. So there was a lot of reaction, let's say, on the way we're trying to quantify, to define the scope. So why resilience now, and why has it taken so much of interest? Well, we all know that basically they were going through a rapid change, which imposes a lot of stress in the energy landscape with the penetration of renewables and so on, which basically increase the reliance on reliable electricity. More and more sectors are being electrified, from the heating, cooling, electrification, and so on. So we need electricity to support a lot of areas of modern societies, which also leads to increasing and complex interdependencies between critical infrastructures. And it makes the whole electricity infrastructure very, very much vulnerable to different threats and shocks. So basically all these factors together created this kind of increasing interest in what we call basically resilience, and we'll be focusing very much on assessing the impact of external threats and shocks on the electricity infrastructure in the lecture today. So we often talk about high impact, low probability events, which basically are events that, as the name implies, occurs with very low probability, but when they actually occur, it's a high impact event. But what is really a HIP event? I mean, this is a very funny event that happened in UK, where there are a lot of bulls and of cows up in the fields. The specific bull called Ron had an itching bum, and he decided to basically scratch his back on a distribution pole and knock down the transformer, which caused basically the outage of over 800 homes. This actually hit the news. It actually basically increased the interest, let's say, in better fencing of the cows and bulls in the fields in UK. So in the CIGRE working group C4.47, which I'm chairing, we're trying to conclude now. We started the activity in 2017. So in 2018, we decided to basically run a survey to see what is actually the high impact low probability events that system operators are facing around the globe. So here you can see a very long list, which should be, most of these are expected, but 1/5 of this, the responders, actually respond about pandemic. The pandemic, this was 2018, so it was 3 years before COVID. So 1/5 of the responders named pandemic as a big threat to power systems. And we have to be, I have to acknowledge that none of the working group members actually paid attention to the pandemic. So as I say here, I don't know if this was based on experience, an epiphany, or a back to the future moment that the responders had to basically name pandemic as a threat to power systems. So this survey was basically distributed to 114 CIGRE members, and we had responders from around the globe, which actually helped us get a good understanding of the experiences, how they understand, and how they quantify resilience around the globe, based also and always on their experiences on the geographic location they are. So we had these themes. So we had questions on what resilience is, the methods and metrics, how they quantify resilience, how they enhance resilience through planning, and also if there is a regulatory framework that actually enforces the system operators to plan for resilience on the country they are. So I will just go through a few of the findings that we had, which are relevant to our presentation as well. So we basically asked if their utilities, their countries distinguish between reliability and resilience concepts, also during operational and capital investment planning. The vast majority said yes, about 60%, and about 40% was no or not certain. The not certain percentage here, which is basically 30%, 1/3 of the responders, is very important, because when we actually asked them after the survey, they actually told us we don't know what resilience is, we don't know what it means, and we don't know how to implement it in our grid code or in our cost-benefit analysis. And then we also asked them what criteria they use during resilience infrastructure operation decision-making. And this was pretty obvious. So basically it was about coordinating the response to the recovery, reducing the restoration time, and reducing the actual impact and consequences on the system. Because we are trying to understand what resilience means for the industry with this survey, we reviewed a lot of definitions from different areas, from different sectors beyond power systems. And we tried to gather some features that we had from the definition. And we put those features into different responses to see basically the most dominant features that they consider in their resilience. So we can see here different characteristics, which I will explain later how we captured all these characteristics in our definition from the CIGRE working group. Now, when it comes to methods and metrics, we basically ask them how they evaluate risk and the vulnerabilities of their power system. And for me, working on probabilistic quantitative assessment, it was very nice to see that about 80%, they're basically applying probabilistic quantitative methods. And also when it comes to metrics, 1/3, they said that they basically consider these risk metrics, conditional value at risk and value at risk metric, will basically focus on the tail of the probability distribution of an event. Having said this, we'll see later that basically the responses are not very aligned with this question. And they also have the traditional metrics, for example, expected interest applied, LOLP, loss of load probability, and so on. I will skip this. Okay, so when it comes to enhancing and planning for resilience, we ask them if they actually consider resilience as part of their power system security by only considering credible contingencies. The vast majority, about 56%, they said yes. So they consider only credible contingencies. So this basically because, as I will explain later, when it comes to resilience, it goes way beyond credible contingencies. And actually, this is what NSOE also says, that basically the extreme events are out of ordinary events. So they are not very much what we call credible or expected contingencies. And also this question here, which if they adopt a risk-informed decision-making approach to justify investments, 44% they said yes, and then more than 50% said either no or not certain. And this conflicting basically with this finding here, where they one-third said about using, not one-third, 35% said that they apply these risk metrics. And here basically they don't really apply risk-informed decision-making, or they consider only credible contingencies. So we could tell from the survey that the respondents were not either very clear or very much understanding perhaps the questions of the questionnaire. And this is about the regulatory frameworks, where I would basically ask them if there is a regulatory incentive that basically encourages them to invest for extreme incidents. And this is the response that we got. So basically, as we expected, about 60% they were following the grid code. And there were also some other initiatives on the energy not supplied and the quality of service incentives that the regulators were giving to them to design the system to withstand and respond quickly from extreme incidents in their respective countries. So gathering all this information together from the survey, we tried to come up with the working group with a short but sharp and precise definition of resilience for power systems. So what we said about resilience is basically the ability of the system to limit the extent, severity, and duration of system degradation following an extreme event. There are much longer definitions on resilience, but we try to do, as I said, a quite short and as holistic as possible definition of the topic. And this definition has been applied by many bodies in our community. It also triggered a lot of discussions about how accurate it is and how applicable it is. Of course, we cannot cover everything, so we try to come up with as best as possible definition of the topic. And we also try to define what we mean by each of these words, so it will be clear for the reader and for basically the audience of the definition. So basically, within CIGRE definition, within CIGRE manuals, the term magnitude usually used, we replace magnitude with two terms, the extent and the severity. So extent, we refer more to the geographic extension, so how big the disturbance will be in terms of the geographic propagation of the event. And with the intensity, we refer basically to the effects of the event on the system. With severity, we clarify that we mean the severity of the event consequences and not the severity of the event itself, because a major disturbance can or cannot have a system degradation. So with severity, basically, as I mentioned, we refer to the severity of the event consequences themselves. And degradation is referred to the deviation from the specific target performances, both in system planning and operation, and also when it comes to infrastructure and operational resilience. And the term extreme event refers basically to high impact, low probability events, or as NSOE refers to it, as I mentioned earlier, goes beyond the ordinary events, and it's considered out of range type of contingencies. And then SOE actually has a methodology for identifying what they call regional electricity crisis scenarios. And they had a round of recommendations recently, which closed in in December, just 3 months ago, to basically redefine their methodology and try to broad basically to understand better the crisis, the electricity crisis scenarios that they should be considering in Europe. And they're gathering basically information from all the member states of EU. So within the definition, we try to define 6 features that or 6 actionable measures that you can apply before, during, or after an extreme event, such as the anticipation, the preparation, the absorption, adaptation, and the rapid recovery, of course, from the event. These are things that were included in previous definitions of resilience, either in power systems or other areas. We also added this last feature, which basically the sustainment of the critical system operation, which basically refers to the minimum system performance that you should achieve after a disturbance in order to enable the everyday functioning and the quick recovery. Because from all the experiences we gathered from the survey and from the working group members and so on, there is a very, very limited possibility if you are exposed to an extreme event and don't have any impact, any consequences on your network. So we acknowledge that, and basically we added an additional feature or an actionable measure, as we said, to basically maintain an acceptable performance and functioning of your infrastructure to recover as quickly as possible. And this is a definition, this is a comparison between reliability and resilience, which I will not go into details because it would take quite a lot of time. But just to highlight that basically when it comes to resilience, as I will say later, we consider contingencies that go beyond the traditional ones that we have within the traditional reliability and deterministic approach of N-1, N-2, and so on. And the goal is actually to maintain, as we said, a minimum level of functioning of performance of your system to actually restore as quickly as possible. And one other big difference is actually when it comes to compliance, if that is actually enforced by the regulatory body of the country. Currently, that is picking up a lot in the agenda of system operators and regulatory and policy bodies within Europe and also across the world. So it starts slowly becoming a regulatory incentive and the requirement from the system operators and the network operators around Europe. In UK, that I know for sure that we have these projects with National Grid. Ofgem is very much pushing now to basically define, understand, and quantify resilience and how to embed it in the cost-benefit analysis. And they're actually in the process now of redefining their cost-benefit analysis in order to include resilience as a criteria for the system planning. And you can find more details on our definition in this paper that I have here. And also other related initiatives that I was involved. There is also the IEEE task force that was looking into the topic. And there are also some initiative from CIGRE that I contributed as a co-author in this report on the resilience of distribution grids. And you can find the reports and the papers in these links, and I will be very happy to share the slides also after the presentation. So when it comes to keeping the lights on, which is basically what we're trying to do in our work, we're trying to basically understand, on the one hand, the impact of these extreme events, and then to make sure that we keep the lights on under any conditions. So we all know about the reliability paradigm, where basically we cannot accept any power outages. So we need to be, simply put, basically the goal of reliability-oriented initiatives and actions is to keep the lights on at all times. When it comes to basically have enough generation to meet the prevailing load demands and to be able to withstand basically the N-1 or N-2 contingencies as you have them in your contingency analysis. So when it comes to resilience, to the resilience paradigm, it's basically not practical and not financially possible to install additional power facilities, full redundancy in your system, and so on to withstand any type of contingencies. As they may vary significantly with time, nature, intensity, and so on. So the target, as we said, basically is to when you have within the resilience paradigm, is to basically sustain the critical system operation to enable the quick recovery. So moving from the N-1 or N-2 reliability criterion, when it comes to resilience, we're talking about N-K, where K can basically be in the order of tens of components of assets being lost in a very short period of time. And the period of time is very important because it does not give time to the system operator to very much react. And we rely on automated protection actions to save the system basically from the further propagation. So here it comes basically the theoretical and the philosophical, if you like, debate, how fair it is, the approach that we're following now for protecting or planning for resilience. Okay, so basically there is the question to which methodology we should actually use within our cost-benefit approach that basically it's fair for resilience planning as well. And the question is if an average decision is a fair decision for resilience planning. And what we mean with this, with the average decision, is that, as I will explain later with some examples, the way that we plan the system now, we run, for example, 1,000, 10,000 scenarios. We take the average indices of energy not supplied, loss of low probability, and so on. And we try to optimize and do as best as we can around those average indices. And by taking average indices, we actually neglect or underestimate a lot the impact of extreme events, which basically have a much lower frequency, but a much higher impact. So while we're protecting against these N-1 or N-2 credible events, the argument here is that they might provide a relatively fair level of reliability to all the customers. Okay, so we also have a lot of redundancy when it comes to reliability to basically ensure this continuous supply of electricity. But when you actually get an N-K event, which basically, as we said, N-K is where we lose a big number of components in a very short period of time, the impact, and including also customer disconnections, will not be fairly distributed across the customer because it's very much depending on the geographic characteristics of the event and how far, as we said earlier, the event will propagate across the system. So within the literature, and within our work as well, there is a trend towards more probabilistic and risk-driven approaches when it comes to planning, to quantifying and planning for resilience, to be more suitable so we can basically recognize the different levels of resilience that we need to provide to the customers. So when we say average and more risk-aware or conditional value at risk and driven decision-making, if we consider this probability distribution of the energy not supplied. So we have on the y-axis the probability, and the x-axis we have an index, whatever the performance indicator will be. In this example, we have the energy not supplied. So we have the mean, which is basically the expected energy not supplied. And we also have these metrics, which can quantify the tail of this probability distribution. And these metrics basically is the value at risk and the condition of value at risk, which they arose basically from the financial sector when they were trying to define the impact of big financial crises, which are very low probability, but when they actually occur, they have a big impact. So what we do when it comes to reliability events and when it comes to planning for reliability, as we said, we take the average of all the events, all the disturbances that might threaten our system, and we try to plan the system to withstand basically and to minimize as much as possible that average value of our performance indicator of the system. But actually, when it comes to resilience events, it's the events that actually happen, as we said, with low probability. So we are basically in this region here of the graph. So we are in the region of the low probability, but high impact. And high impact here is translated with high energy not supplied. So we're basically trying in our work to co-optimize in a way the average metric and the conditional metric in a way to basically co-optimize the performance of the system against the expected risks, what you expect to have in your day-to-day operation of the system, and also what you expect to have with a much lower probability, as we see here, but with a much higher impact. So this basically summarizes what I just said. So we try to basically include and complement resilience aspect with reliability aspects. And the drawback we're having at the beginning of our work in this, on this topic is when we're trying to propose a resilience investment or the resilience aware planning approach to the system operators, they were a bit reluctant in taking on board those recommendations because the response was, what if it never happens again? So you might spend millions and millions of euros or pounds or dollars, whatever the currency is, to invest to something to improve, let's say, I don't know, the robustness of a corridor and so on to an event, which might not happen again. So what we're trying to do is we try to find the investment portfolios that can actually have benefits for the day-to-day operation of the system, as well as benefits when it comes to performance of the system under stress. So if we manage to do that successfully, then the system operator and the decision-making body will be easier convinced to support an investment like this. So when it comes to the current regulatory standards, talking about resilience and investments and incentivizing basically investments in high impact, low probability events. In UK, Ofgem, the electricity and gas regulator, electricity regulator in UK, in RIO 1, which basically was the regulatory framework before the one we have now, which is RIO 2, it had a threshold for national grid of 316 megawatt hours of energy not supplied per year. So if national grid was below that target, it was rewarded by Ofgem. If it was above, it was penalized for the poor performance of the system. And then in RIO 2, which is basically the current regulatory framework in UK, this target was further restricted to 147 megawatt hours per year. Now, this refers to average energy not supplied across the whole year, okay? These are some events, there's some data that we got from a report there. Now there is a new report that was released recently, which actually shows the events that were above this threshold of RIO 1 of 316 megawatt hours demand lost. And there also the blackout of August 2019, which was above 1 gigawatt of demand lost in UK. So we immediately see here, with this simple example, that although National Grid did very well for the majority of the cases, there were two cases where basically it was very much above the target, and a lot of cases that were very close to that target. So what this is telling us is what we said earlier as well. So when we use average metrics, on average, you can do well, as we see here, okay? On average, National Grid was doing well, as it was able to withstand a lot of disturbances very satisfactory. But there are also these kind of events which refer more to large-scale disturbances, not only to extreme weather, but also to loss of many assets in a very short period of time, which National Grid basically did not perform so well. So this raises basically the question, as we said earlier, if using average indices is actually fair and ideal when it comes to also planning the system against unexpected events. And we also did a small analysis of outage data from UK. So one of my PhD students in Manchester, back in the time, he developed a code which he was basically reading in real time outage data from a lot of DNOs in UK. So what we see basically with these graphs here, which is the blue refers to weather, although weather it was not really frequent. It was only 2% of the power cuts. We see basically that the customers disconnected and the duration that the customers were actually disconnected because of weather is ranked as number 1 in UK. So this, in combination with what we said earlier about the expectations from the system operator UK, highlights basically the need to actually consider contingencies that are beyond the credible or the expected that you usually do in your planning. So these are quite long lists which we explain now, so I will just skip. So when it comes to modeling a resilience event, this is what they call the resilience triangle, which was basically initiated mainly from earthquake engineering colleagues, where we basically have in the x-axis the time, and the y-axis we have, again, any metric you have. Here we have the supply and demand. So we have the preconditions state, where everything is fine. Then we have the hazard, we have the event here. We have the sharp decrease of the performance of the system, which is followed by the system restoration. So we see that basically we start the system restoration immediately after the event that happened. And the area of this can be the energy not supplied during the event. So we have basically the drop of the performance of the system, and then we have the rate of the system restoration following the event. Now, this kind of triangle is very much applicable to specific events. For example, when it comes to earthquakes, where we have this sharp drop in the performance of the system. This is just an example from Chile, an earthquake that happened in 2010. It was one of the biggest earthquakes that happened, where we see basically clearly this kind of triangle-ish performance of the system. So we have the drop and then immediately the restoration of the system. And this kind of triangle can apply to much shorter term events. For example, earthquakes, cyber attacks, where the system will be hit and then you get this resilience, this performance degradation straight away. But when we see some other events, for example, this kind of this black system event that happened in South Australia in September of 2016, and this is a figure from the AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator of Australia. We see that we have the progression of the event here. So basically, this is not so sharp. It covers basically a broad time horizon, so it was not that sharp. Then we have the post-event, then we have, some time where we see that the system here was trying to start recovering. So it has some post-event time to actually coordinate, to start your black star units, and so on, and to do the emergency management. And then you had this kind of long stage where the demand was recovering. So it was not exactly this kind of triangle performance that we have here, but there was also this kind of time here that is spent, the system spent in a degraded performance until you actually start implementing your restoration strategies. So this understanding basically helped us develop what we call the resilience trapezoid. So the resilience trapezoid basically is trying to capture the different phases that the power system might lie during a disturbance. So I can have the pre-disturbance resilience state, where basically, and here we have the time sequence and the type of action that you can apply in each of the phases. So if you know that an event is approaching, if let's say it's not an earthquake or a cyber attack, let's say if it's a wildfire or a windstorm or a flood, severe raining and so on, that you know is approaching your system, you have some time to apply some preventive measures. Then we have the event, which basically is here, that hits the network, and we have phase one, which is basically the progress of the disturbance. Here you can apply some corrective actions to try to minimize this degradation of your performance. Then we have the end of the event here, which basically the blue curve stops. And we have this post-disturbance degraded state of the system where the emergency coordination takes place. So you decide basically, you assess the system state, you try to develop as much of situation awareness you can on the state of your system to try to coordinate basically as effectively as possible your restoration strategies. If it refers to damaged assets, this may include, for example, the dispatching of your repair crews to the affected areas to start restoring your infrastructure and so on. And then you have the actual restoration of the system in phase 3. So this trapezoid has been applied and is being used by many scholars and also industrial organizations. It has been quantified in many ways. It was also argued that it's not linear, which I know is not linear, but we try to basically come up with something similar with a triangle. And nothing is linear and nothing is quantified as linear in this kind of work. So what we also tried to do when we actually developed this trapezoid is how it relates to these known 5 operational states of a power system that were introduced by Finn and Carson back in the 70s, 78, where basically we have the normal state. This is a direct copy paste from their paper, where the quality, at least the version I found, was not very clear. So this is much clearer that you can actually read. So we have the normal condition, then we have the alert condition, we'll have some violation of constraints. Then depending on the severity of the event, you can go to the emergency or the extreme conditions. And then you have the restoration basically after this kind of conditions of the alert, the emergency, or the extremis conditions. So in our very initial papers, in our very initial works on the topic, we try to link the two. So we have the trapezoid here on the background, as I've shown earlier, and we try to see basically how those operational states that were very well accepted and very well applied by the power system community actually map on this trapezoid. So we're starting from the normal state. Then if you have some inadequate security margin, you drop to the alert state, okay? If you manage and if you're fast enough and if you can apply preventive actions, then you can go from the alert state to the normal state, okay? But if the violation of the constraints continue, so if there are more faults, then you can go to the emergency conditions or the extreme conditions for highly severe disturbances. And once you reach this state, you can basically apply emergency actions, so it will take you to the restoration phase. Or if the cascading propagates, then you will go at the very bottom of the trapezoid where we have the very extreme condition in red here. And then you need to apply a lot of extreme actions to actually enter the restoration phase. So this is basically another conceptual thing that we try to introduce in the community to link our proposition of the trapezoid with these very well-known operational states in power systems. Okay, so after developing this kind of fundamental understanding of resilience through the resident project back between 2012 and 2015, more or less, we developed a multi-phase resilience assessment approach where we basically try to distinguish the steps that we need to do in order to quantify the impact of an extreme event on the system. So the first thing that we realized we have to do, of course, is to model the threat itself. So we need to model basically the wind speeds if it comes for a windstorm, the earthquakes if it comes to an earthquake, and so on. So we need to have a model to actually help us simulate the impact of the event on the system. So that's the first thing we try to do. Then, in collaboration with some structural engineers in UK, specifically in Newcastle University, we developed different fragility curves, which fragility curves basically, they relate the intensity of a hazard with the failure probability of an asset in relation to that intensity. So let's say if it's a windstorm of 45 meters per second, what's the probability of an asset tripping at that wind speed at a given time? So we model the event. We have the time and the hazard dependent failure probabilities of the assets. And then we basically throw them into power system analysis software. Basically is Monte Carlo simulations in order to simulate thousands of stochastic scenarios to try to quantify the impact of the event on the system. And here, instead of using the traditional failure and repair rates, we try to use this kind of weather-induced failure probabilities distribution functions of the assets, and then for each Monte Carlo simulation, we're just sampling those distributions to come up with the failure probabilities that we're using in our simulations. And then we have the restoration of the system, where we basically use again probabilistic approaches, and then later on in different projects, we try to fine-tune our assumptions to be as realistic as possible when it comes to the actual practices in system operators. And actually here in the project we had with National Grid, we talked about prepositioning of repair crews. We did some work on that as well. So you know that the hazard is coming, a snowstorm, for example, a flood, and so on. So a lot of academics work on that, including ourselves, to actually preposition your repair crews in strategic locations. And one of the engineers from National Grid actually told us that this doesn't make sense, because imagine if I preposition a repair crew somewhere and that repair crew is stuck there because of a snowstorm and they cannot move. So, which basically is a fair logic when it comes to this idea of prepositioning repair crews, which is not very much efficient. So in our very first approach to characterize and to model a wind event, this is the 29 bus system, the simplified version of UK, of the transmission network in UK. In our very first approach, because we are not very experts in modeling events, we thought of splitting the system to 6 homogeneous weather regions and assume a weather profile for each of these regions as being affected by windstorms. So these are the assumptions that we did for the wind speed in the different regions, which, as I will say later, this is not realistic. This was just our first approach to model the impact. So we use the fragility curves, which the Newcastle colleagues provided when it comes to transmission lines and when it comes to towers. So basically, these are just some examples of the curves we used. So up to a specific wind speed, there's a very low probability of failing, where here we used the traditional failure probabilities of the assets. And then following a specific windstorm, the failure probability of the assets were increasing until a specific windstorm where basically the failure probability was equal to 1 for very severe wind conditions. This was just the assumptions, and then in the second lecture, basically I was saying how we took into account the ambiguity, the uncertainty with these fragility curves when it comes to planning. So we plugged those fragility curves into our Monte Carlo simulations to model basically the impact of windstorms on the Great Britain transmission network. And we used different quantitative metrics, including expected energy not served and the loss of load frequency. And we exposed the system to a lot of events, to thousands of simulated scenarios. And National Grid back then, as it is now, as I will say later in the project we completed last year, they were interested on which events to focus more their analysis and their planning. So that was the reason that we exposed the system to a lot of events with increasing basically maximum wind speed in each of those events. So in the y-axis here, we have the loss of load frequency and the expected energy not supplied. And in the x-axis, we have the maximum wind gust speed that we simulated in each of the scenarios in our analysis. So basically, as we're increasing, of course, the wind speed, we were able to identify the regions where the Great Britain transmission network was highly resilient and less resilient. So when basically the wind speed at which the system was starting having issues in their operation, and they were starting seeing customers being disconnected. This was on a simulated environment, but basically National Grid confirmed at that point that this is about the wind speed region that they're starting having issues in their system. Maybe not so severe issues as we simulated, but this is where they expect to start losing some demand in UK. And this basically is very much in line with some work we did with Pierre and Pierre Etienne, and we have this paper together, where we can also see that for more severe events, here the orange is the wind speed PDF, and for very extreme wind conditions, we actually see similar trends as we've seen in the previous simulation results. So the works pretty much align that we did together with Pierre. What you can also do, what we also did with this simplified network. So National Grid, even for this kind of simplified system, was interested in learning more, which were basically the critical circuits in the system. So we applied this risk achievement worth metric, which basically what it means, you make each corridor sequentially 100% reliable, so it never trips, and then you see how much your risk is reduced basically by making each of the components 100% reliable. And this is a graphical representation of the results, where basically highly red, it means that the asset is very critical, and blue is less critical. So we can see here that around the London area, here we see a lot of reds and a lot of yellowish, which basically it's all the transmission corridors that are feeding London as the big demand center in UK. And here is Birmingham, and here is Manchester, where basically we can see that around the main demand nodes, of course, as expected, the criticality is very much high. And here is poor Scotland, where is blue, mainly because here is low demand. But in reality, when you actually start considering the wind generation here and the wind basically movement from north to south, these corridors become extremely critical, as we see the west and these corridors in UK, where we see that it's quite critical as well. Okay, so we basically quantified in Résumé project it was the first approach to quantify resilience, and then we asked ourselves how you can actually enhance resilience. So there are broadly three main areas, which of course they have subcategories that you can enhance resilience. So you can make your network stronger, more robust to the event itself, to never break. You can make your network more redundant, so you can add more and more equipment to have additional transmission paths and so on, additional transformers and so on in your system. You can make your network more responsive, so you can respond much faster to an emergency. So we tried with a very simple approach to test this kind of strategies. So with the robustness, we basically shifted, as we show here, the fragility curves to the right. So what we did by 20% basically. So this is the fragility curve that we used in the base case scenario, and we moved the fragility curve to the right by 20%, which means by moving the curve to the right here, we make the asset more robust, stronger to extreme winds. So that was the robust case. For the responsive case, we assume that the restoration times were reduced by 20%. And by redundancy, of course, we added parallel corridors to the existing ones in UK. So when it comes to, and we tested this for different wind scenarios and maximum wind speeds. So when it comes to a maximum wind storm of 40 meters per second, we see here in the x-axis, we have the number of line circuits where the actions were applied. So making, for example, 5 transmission corridors redundant, stronger and the restoration faster, then 10, 15, 20, and so on until we apply it to the whole system. Again, this was a theoretical approach. It can never happen because obviously it's not affordable to do that. But on theoretical level, we try to do this to see the impacts. So for wind speeds up to 40 meters per second, of course, it was much more efficient to make the system more robust, which is the green bars here, okay? Then it was followed by making the network more redundant, which is the red bars. And lastly, it was more efficient to make the system more responsive. So improve your restoration times in the network. As we move though to 50 meters per second, so for wind speeds up to 50 meters per second, which is considered quite extreme, we see that still the most efficient approach was making your system more robust. But now the second more efficient way was making basically your system more responsive. So responding faster to the event. So having the means to restore your system faster than you did before. And the redundancy case study, which is the red bars here, now ranks as last one. Of course, it has improvement because simply your redundant assets can also fail in case of an emergency. So as the wind speed and as the severity of the event becomes stronger, we basically see this for 60 meters per second. We basically see that first making your system more robust and then making more responsive with shorter restoration times is actually more efficient than the traditional reliability, more oriented approach of adding more and more assets in your system. So making your system more flexible, more responsive is actually more efficient than having more and more redundancy. And this can basically help evaluate different resilience investments, as we would do in the second lecture, to see how we can balance all these kind of investment approaches. We also did work on combining wind and flood modeling and impact quantification, so going beyond just winds, especially in UK and other parts of the world. Floods is a big threat. So this is a different version of the fragility curves we saw before when it comes to wind speed for lines and towers. So again, in the y-axis we have the probability of failure. In the x-axis we have the wind speed. And we also developed or adapted, better to say, fragility curves when it comes to accumulated rainfall for flooding basically of substations. So now we move from just one event, we move to two events modeled together when it comes to winds and also floods. And these are basically the results we got, which, as we expected, especially for the simplified system of UK, floods, which was a bigger threat than windstorms. As we see here, the first bar is where we consider both windstorms and floods. The second bar is when we consider only floods, and the third bar is when we consider windstorm, with different return period for each of the events of windstorms and floods. So this actually gave us a bit better understanding of the actual threat and the actual impact on the system. So moving forward and trying to see how we can use this, what we called when we introduced this trapezoid, we developed the FLEP metric system, which basically the FLEP metric system refers to fast, low, extended, and promptly. And it helps us quantify, understand and quantify what we are most interested in each of these phases of the trapezoid. So in the first phase, during the disturbance, during the progress of the disturbance, we are very much interested in how fast resilience declines and how low it drops. So your indicator, so your performance indicator, whatever that is, how fast it declines and how low it gets. So basically the grade of this curve here and the difference between these two figures you have here. Okay, so how fast it drops and how low it drops. In the second phase, we're interested in basically how extensive is this state. So basically, how long is the duration of phase 2? In other words, how long it takes to the system operator to actually start applying their restoration strategies. In the third phase, of course, is how promptly the network recovers. So we try to come with some names here, fast, low, and so on, to actually come up with an acronym. You can use different words here. So this is basically the FLEP metric system. So, and it's applied again quite broadly in the literature. We're very happy to see that. So again, how fast and how low your performance indicator declines here, how long it takes to actually start restoring systems, restoring stuff that tripped, and how fast you can actually do it in the restoration state. I mean, this can be, I mean, it sounds quite fundamental and quite obvious, but for me, at least personally, it's a nice way and a very simple way of quantifying the performance of the system during time. And an additional thing you can do, as I will show later, is when you have a strategy in mind to implement in your planning phase, you can actually implement the strategy, run again all your simulations, so on, and see how the performance of your system changes. Because it might have an improvement in the first phase, in the second phase, or in the third phase, and then you try to see which investment portfolio co-optimizes the whole trapezoid performance. So this is just an example, again, based on simulations we did in UK, where we have different time-dependent resilience indicators for the base case study. So we have the time here, and here we have the percentage. We just chose as indicators the transmission lines you have online, the generation you have connected, and the load you have connected. I apologize for the people in the back. I don't think you can really read this, but I can send you the slides. Okay, so we see here this kind of performance that we saw in the previous examples. For example, this event that happened in Australia, where we have this sharp decrease in the indicators. There is this phase where basically, as we said earlier, we try to start recovering, and then we have the restoration of the system. And here is basically how these indicators can be quantified using this FLEP metric system. So here is the ratio of how fast we're losing lines, generation and demand. Here is how low these indicators went. So we saw that we lost, for example, 26% of the lines, 12.5% of your generation, and then 6% of your load. And the same for the extension of this, of the duration of this state here. So when you're starting to recover, and then how promptly you recover as a ratio for your transmission lines, generation, and demand you have connected. So as I said, this you can apply this metric system and you can quantify these metrics. So this is now focusing on transmission lines for this example. So we have the base quantification here for the FLEP metrics. So we have again the ratio of lines tripped per hour, how many lines you lost, how long it takes to start recovering, and then the ratio of the lines restored per hour. So then you can apply, as mentioned, the strategy you may have in mind, the investment strategy you may have in mind. And this is basically very simply making your system 20% more robust or making your response 20% faster. Okay? And then we see how this trapezoid performance can change. So when we do the 20% more robust approach, of course, we reduce significantly the F and the L metric here. So we reduce significantly how low the system performance will drop and how fast you're losing lines because your system is more robust. Okay, so you are basically, what you are doing here, you're optimizing your the first leg, the first part, here I should stop it here. You're optimizing this phase of the trapezoid. So you're optimizing basically the first phase of the progress of the disturbance. And the others remain pretty much the same. When you apply the 20% more responsive case, what you are doing, you're optimizing the second phase of the trapezoid. So you start your restoration, your recovery earlier, and your restoration is much faster. So we see that basically when we apply a different approach and different strategy, we can optimize different part of the and different stage of the performance of the system. So making the system more robust, of course, it will reduce the degradation level, and making your system more responsive, it will improve the emergency coordination and the recovery of the system. And in the second seminar, we'll see how we can plug in these metrics into planning to come up with a portfolio of investments that can actually optimize the whole area of the trapezoid. And this, if you want to do multiple events in very short time, and it basically shows how different indicators perform for different intensities of events. So as I mentioned, is this realistic? It's not, and we acknowledge that. This is basically what we first assumed in order to start working in this area, where I said that we assume these 6 regions. Of course, these 6 regions is not realistic because you cannot have the same conditions, for example, in London, in the whole London area or in North Scotland all the time. So what we next did, couple of years ago, in 2018, 2019, we started working ourselves. We didn't want to rely on external models. So we developed our own event simulators. So we developed what we called Resilient, which is basically a realistic event simulator for international location independent energy network testing. As you can imagine, we spend a lot of time on the acronym to come up with something that it recalls resilience. So this is a multi-stage approach. And it's a very modular and a very flexible model. So we have in stage 1 the input data. Of course, we have the network data, and we have also historical event data, some indication of the fragility of the system to the simulated event. And also what the simulator can do, we acknowledge that sometimes the coordinates can be quite confidential. And because we want to simulate the hazard that the network is exposed as realistically as possible, the simulator can actually take some central coordinates and it can create again a fictitious network around those coordinates. So we can basically generate a network in a specific area with fictitious coordinates if the coordinates cannot be shared. Then we have the event modeling itself, where basically we extract event characteristics from the historical data, and we have the spatial and temporal modeling. And then we have the fragility assessment and the vulnerability assessment of the system to the simulated event. This is just an example on a Portuguese test system we did in the e-Universal project. We need to work on our visuals, okay? This is not very, professional-wise, but it's effective. So this is on the background of the system, and this is just a windstorm that passes across the system. So in a temporal and spatial manner, it can tell you which lines were affected, which were indicated by yellow here, and which lines actually tripped during the event. So this is indicated by the red line there. So this is basically a spatial and temporal model of an event, of a windstorm, of a flood. We also have work on wildfires, as I will explain later. So this helps us basically to model in a bit more realistic way the event as it moves across the system. And this is very important because we actually want to capture the time correlation between the outages. And this is what sets this kind of events different from the traditional N-1 and -2, in the sense that basically the outages can be correlated in time as the event propagates across the system. So we have the spatial and temporal modeling of the event. Then we apply, as we said before, the asset fragility assessment. Then we get the time series status of the network. So the red here are basically the assets that tripped. And then we can do the impact assessment as we did before to calculate different indices that we're interested in, such as the energy not supplied. We said this, okay. And this is another example we did for that project I mentioned earlier with USA, where we simulate different hurricanes. This is on Florida, because the case study in Hawaii turned out to be quite confidential, so we can't share results about that. So this is an example in Florida, where we see the hurricane, which is this pinkish thing that is moving here. And as it moves, we see that the color of the assets here changes from blue to yellow and then red. And we see that the assets that were in the eye of the hurricane, the center of the hurricane, were actually more affected and tripped. So here, as the hurricane moves, you can actually see how many substations, how many lines, and so on have been affected and tripped from the event. And of course, all this information can be extracted in usable Excel files or CSV files, and whatever you want to use them for your own analysis. And we're currently working on a graphical user interface for this model, where the end user can generate by themselves the hazard scenarios they want, and they can play with different features here, such as, for example, the wind gust speed and direction of the event, and so on. And this refers to the hazard simulation. As you may see here, there's also another tab on the optimizer on the planning model, and that we're trying to make more user-friendly, let's say, to the end user, let that be a system operator or a consultancy company or whatever it is. So we start with the generation of the system, then we have the generation of the hazards, and then we plug those hazards into a planning model that I will explain in the second lecture, where we take all these hazards, we feed them as inputs into the optimizer to give the portfolios of investments for optimizing as much as possible your resilience performance. So moving on to the Forward Resilience Measure project, which is a project that we had with National Grid from 2020 to 2021, 22. It's a project basically that was split in different work streams. So we had a multi-tier approach. So we had tier one, where basically we tried to screen all the models or the indices and so on to identify the existing engine initiatives, National Grid electricity transmission, to map them into our models. We're mostly focused on tier three, where we developed the quantitative resilience assessment model for National Grid in UK. A few slides on the theoretical, on the qualitative approach in the project, because we had the qualitative and the quantitative methods. The qualitative method was led by Europe in UK, where they tried basically to run different workshops and to talk to engineers from National Grid to understand their resilience, readiness, and maturity. So they developed this kind of framework where they had three main categories, where it links to leadership, strategy, and workforce, community, stakeholders, and financing, and environment and infrastructure. So they defined 12 goals with 43 indicators to give an indication basically of the system's resilience. So they ran this questionnaire and this workshop with National Grid in order to understand and to self-assess their resilience maturity. And with this qualitative assessment, it was not only about reinforcing the network resilience, but it was also about reinforcing the business continuity of National Grid when it comes to an emergency, because they're both equally important. So what ARB was trying to understand through these activities is if National Grid actually had the mechanism in place to respond quickly to an event which might disrupt the system or might disrupt the continuation of the business and the organization itself. Okay, as COVID, for example, disrupted a lot of operations of many organizations around the world. So within the quantitative resilience assessment work that we did, there were three main steps. So the first one we developed, of course, and validated the network of National Grid, which was not given to us, although it was funded by National Grid. We developed it from some public data, and then we spent a lot of time validating that model with National Grid. Then we simulated external shocks and network stresses, including both hazards and future energy scenarios. So National Grid was very much interested in understanding in the future how future scenarios they have in mind, as such, for example, increasing electrification of heating, transportation, and so on, how such a system might behave under stress. So when exposed to a flood, to a windstorm, or whatever that stress is, how it will actually perform. And then we output different metrics from our studies. So this is a network that we used. I don't want to go into very much detail. So we focus only in this project on Wales and England. So we let Scotland alone because that is operated by Scottish Power. So this was basically a system of 740 buses with 270 substations and so on. And this is the annual electricity demand on an hourly basis that we used for the project. So again, we had this hazard modeling. So these are different trajectories of windstorms and flood events that we simulated for National Grid. So each of these lines is basically a specific event that we simulated across the system. So if we take a closer look, so these are just different trajectories. If we take a closer look, then we see basically that we have the spatial, the temporal trajectory of the event on the system. And then we can identify which assets were actually affected by the event and the timestamp that each asset was affected. And then as we've shown before, we can basically using different fragility functions that were fine-tuned with the engineers of National Grid, we can define at each time step which transmission corridor actually failed. Okay, so with red here is the lines that tripped, and with green, of course, are the lines that survived from the event. So while we're running the project, very interestingly, the National Infrastructure Commission of UK published the report on the resilience of the critical infrastructures in UK. So one of the recommendations they were having for the network operators in UK is to define what they call the breaking point of their critical infrastructure. So the breaking point is basically the intensity of an event that will make the infrastructure break. Okay, in very simple terms. And breaking can mean a lot of things depending on the infrastructure you're talking about. In power systems, that breaking point is basically the point where you start having demand disconnected. So while we're running the project, we actually developed this approach as we've shown before, and the work we did with Pierre and Pierre-Etienne, which is very much similar to this. We exposed the system to different thousands of windstorms. And these are the simulated scenarios that we had. So each dot of this refers to a windstorm that we simulated. So now we're focusing only on windstorms, so we're not simulating normal conditions. Where we can basically see, we can quantify here, the red line here is the breaking point of the system that we simulated for UK. Okay, this again is simulation based. So with this simulation, we can define the expected energy not supplied per windstorm. We can show the CVAR value, so the conditional value at risk, focusing on the most extreme windstorm that we simulated, the probability of interruption to supply, and of course, the breaking point, which now is 38.5 meters per second for UK. In the previous study we did with the simplified network in the Résumé project, which was 6 years before this, it was about 36, 37 meters per second. So it was pretty much aligned, and again, it is pretty much what National Grid expects from the assisted performance when exposed to such events. So then what we did, the similar approach again, we tried to make the system more robust. So we kind of shifted the fragility curves to the right to see how the system will behave in steps of 5%. And of course, as we make the system more robust, both the expected energy not supplied and the CIGRE, the conditional value of energy not supplied, reduces significantly, as we can see in this figure. And then we repeated the same simulation for each robustness level of the system. And these are just some examples that basically it shows that, of course, as expected, as we make the system more robust, the breaking point moves more and more to the right. So this is the breaking point of the initial study we did for the base case, let's say, fragility and robustness level of the system. And as we make it 5, 10, 15, and so on % more robust, the breaking point of the infrastructure moves to higher wind speeds, as it was anyway expected. And this is the same with the problem. And we also did the same approach for recovery times, for restoration basically, which pretty much led to the same results for the system. Now, interestingly, what we next did in the project, because we kind of finished what we had to do and we still had some time in the project, National Grid asked us to evaluate the benefits on different investments they had in mind when it comes to resilience improvement. So they gave us these 10 options from their network option assessment framework, which basically includes reinforcement, includes upgrading and uprating of existing transmission corridors, as well as building new corridors. Now, these decisions for investments for National Grid were made on their traditional cost-benefit analysis for reinforcing, let's say, the capacity of the system or for reliability purposes, and so on and so forth. So the aim here was actually to understand if these investments actually make sense from a resilience perspective. So if we plug these investments into the simulators we had. So this shows in a graphical manner the investment we considered. And this figure here shows the expected energy not supplied in megawatt hours per windstorm for the different options. The straight dotted line is the base case of expected energy not supplied that we had, which is what we had before. And each of the dots is basically the expected energy not supplied we're getting for when we apply each of these investments independently in the system. We see that basically there is some improvement for some of those options, but it's very marginal. It's very small. And this is what they actually expected, and it makes sense because they were not designed in order to reinforce the resilience of the system. They were designed and they were decided to serve different purposes, which they do, but not when it comes to reinforcing the integrity and the robustness of the system to extreme events, because our analysis showed that actually the location of this were not the locations that were actually affected by extreme events. So they serve their own purpose, and they do, but not when it comes to large-scale disturbances in the system. And the similar trend was observed for the other indices that we used, including CIGRE and probability of interruption to supply. What we also did, as aforementioned, we took the future scenarios of National Grid and we translated those to system demand. So National Grid has different future scenarios which can be found online. They're very well documented. And we simply, which includes basically increasing in penetration of different low carbon technologies, CHP, PV, wind, and so on. And we translated those portfolios to demand. Okay, as simple as this, we didn't do any spatial analysis and so on of the future energy scenarios. And we tried to repeat the same simulations, the same analysis to calculate basically the indices that we did before for the base case study. And we've seen that some of those future scenarios are more fragile, are more vulnerable to extreme shocks, and those scenarios were the ones that were dependent on increasing electrification. So the more reliant on the future scenarios were or resilient and reliable electricity supply, the more vulnerable, of course, they were to interruptions. And as I mentioned, we now have the follow-up of that project, the whole energy system resilience vulnerability assessment, which building on the understanding we got from the previous project, this project solely focuses on how to basically embed resilience into long-term decision making, also take into account decarbonization pathways. So we try to integrate resilience and decarbonization planning into one framework. So imagine you have, for example, a scenario that you're adding more and more and more renewables in the system. What will happen if a big event hits the system? Or what will happen if you have what we call now a Duke fruit event, where the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine for a week or two in your system, as we have in Cyprus. In Cyprus, we're putting more and more PV, but even in Cyprus, there are periods that we don't have sun for a week or two. So if we move to 100% or close to 100% renewable rich systems, what will happen if you have those kind of prolonged events of low renewable potential? So this is what this project is about. We completed 2 phases of this project, and we're now applying for the final, it's about £10 million project, in order to bring everything into practical applications for national grid and for electricity Northwest. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, I talked a lot. Sorry, I hope I didn't tire you. Yeah. Okay, so I will try to speed up then. So we did work on earthquakes in Chile as well. So we used different fragility curves as we did before. Now we have the pin ground acceleration of the earthquake with the failure probability for substations. And we followed a similar approach as we did before with windstorms and floods. Now basically we simulate thousands of earthquakes across Chile, which here is the north part of the electricity transmission network of Chile, which until very recently was disconnected from the south part. Now they have the HVDC link connecting north and south. So each of these dots represents a simulated earthquake, the epicenter of an earthquake. And basically here are 3 representative examples of different indicators that we quantified for Chile when it comes to earthquakes, including the islands that were formed, the generation units that were damaged, the substations, the recovery times, and so on that we had for different events. And you can also do the same analysis we did before, identifying the critical substations and the critical generators that in the north part of Chile when it comes to earthquake resiliency. We also did work on wildfires. We started this work quite recently, a couple of years ago, as wildfire is becoming an increasing threat to power systems, even in places in the world that we haven't seen wildfires before, like Siberia and so on. So we have models that can basically simulate the spatial and temporal movement of a wildfire, taking into account the probability of ignition, the speed of the spread and direction, the height and the width of the flame, and also the number of ignitions that we have and the number of fires that we have at a time in a system, which is very important because when a fire starts, it's not just one, but then there are hundreds, tens or hundreds fires happening, unfortunately, at the same time. So we also developed different fragility curves driven from data that we gathered from Europe and also from Chile and the United States. So we try to gather some real experiences with colleagues that we have in different parts of the world. So basically these fragility curves, what they do, they relate the probability of failure of an overhead line conductor with the distance of the fire and the wind speed that we have at the moment, as it defines very much the direction, the speed of the direction of the fire. So we took these wind fragility curves and we plugged them into our models that we have. in order to quantify the threat of wildfires in the Concepcion power system in Chile. So this is a representation of the system in the specific area in Chile. And with this work, what you can do, basically, you can quantify different indices as we had before. For example, the severity risk index and the energy not supplied as a function of the number of fires you have active in the system. This is just an example that we simulate a lot of fires around those regions. And also as a function of the height of the flame of the fire, as it affects a lot the ampacity, the transfer capability of the conductor, as well as its failure probability. So we modeled all this into one single framework. We also did work on extreme temperatures and water scarcity, which I don't want to go into details. I don't have time here anyway. So we tried to model the impact of extreme temperatures and water unavailability on the cooling of big thermal power plants, which is becoming quite important now as the temperature are increasing, the water is becoming less and less, even in areas like UK. So we try to see quantifying different metrics, such as, for example, the frequency of capacity shortage, when it comes to the impact of high temperatures and water availability for cooling, and what that actually means for the big thermal power plants that we have now active in the system. Very briefly, when it comes to the Borneo Island work that we did within the TERS project in Malaysia, so what we are tasked basically from Sarawak Energy in this specific project to do is to quantify the impact of floods and landslides in Borneo Island, so to come up with a profile of floods and landslides in the island, which landslides we didn't do, some other colleagues did, again from Newcastle University, and to try to see basically different scenarios for electrifying remote islands. So each of the triangles here is an island, is a village, and this is the flood mapping, which blue basically, it shows high flood areas, and the landslides probability, which is basically these red dots that we see here across the map. So we have different scenarios for electrifying those islands, those villages. So it was following the existing roads. So you had your pathway, the pathway to follow the road to basically put your distribution poles and go to the villages, to avoid areas with moderate or high risk of landslides, and to avoid areas with moderate or high risk of flooding. So this just shows an example where we can reach all these remote villages on Borneo Island by following existing roads, which, however, those goes through areas of high risk of landslides and floods according to our models and according to experiences that they had. As you remember in the previous slides, we've shown a flooded road leading to these villages. So what we proposed alternatively is to basically avoid areas of high risk. This blue line here, as I mentioned, is following the road, which has a moderate risk of landslides, and that is actually approved from experiences. This red line here shows basically the infrastructure to be built, which is at low risk. However, there's no access with a road, so they had to go in the jungle and actually build this infrastructure, which they actually did in reality. So they applied this path for the infrastructure, which so far, it's been 2-3 years that they did it, has not been affected. So far, so good. Okay, so closing. So in this seminar, we talked about what resilience is, and we've seen different methods about quantifying the impact of different events on the system. So in the next lecture, what we're going to be doing, we'll be taking all these models and plugging them into planning models, okay? So we'll see how we take these experiences and these models that we have, the impact quantification models, and see how we can basically develop the portfolios that can help us reduce the impact of those events. So feel free to join us if you want to learn more. And this again, the overview. And we also have a book coming at the end of the year, hopefully, if we finish the chapters, that we hopefully publish by the end of 2024. Okay? So thank you. Thank you very much. It was not bad enough.